So I would like to welcome everybody back for our second morning panel for this incredible convening of minds and hearts for a promise kept, the inspiring life and works of Suzan Shown Harjo, that we're all here to celebrate her and her accomplishments, and to also reflect and integrate thoughts about how she's impacted all of us in all of the different aspects of her life. On our next panel, we have a really powerful combination of four presenters that have been formative and foundational as well in so many ways. And so each of them will be speaking and then have a point to converge, really focusing on areas of policy and culture and cultural policy, and making the invisible visible and real and in action. We have Dr. Michael McNally, who's a professor at Carleton College, specialist in Native religious studies, who's also spent a great deal of time talking with Suzan. Dr. James Ridingen, a professor at University of Arizona.
No, Arizona State.
Oh, Arizona State.
I noticed that too late to correct it.
Arizona State, the better institution. Sorry, I'm gonna be like booed off the stage in a minute. I'm sorry. To address matters of repatriation as a human right and an ongoing struggle. And we have our founding director, guide, visionary, person who made this place happen and has made this a home of thought and intellectual conversation and emotion and art, and is really realized this dream. Dr. Richard West, who's the president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West. So good to see you here. And our current director of NMAI, also somebody who's taken us into this next phase and what came after opening and after foundation, and is also bringing us forward in this consideration of Suzan, our director of National Museum of the American Indian, Kevin Gover, who will be talking about the National Museum of the American Indian and the history of Native nations. So with that, we'll start with Michael. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Gabi, and good morning. I am so honored beyond measure to be among these good people, and to my good grad school friend Gabi, and to all of you on this wonderful day. I've had the good fortune to get to know Suzan in the course of my work for a book trying to rethink religious freedom law as it might better be applied to the claims of Native nations. And as, I guess, the non-Native guest on the program today, Tina will agree perhaps the Anishinaabe word for Scandinavians like myself in Minnesota is a gungos, which is the same word applied to chipmunks. But as that non-Native guest, perhaps I can bear witness to the way that Suzan engages and even mentors non-Native allies. Patient, at times appropriately impatient, but always respectful, witty, and gracious. So thank you, Suzan. As this gathering will surely agree, Native nations emphasize the sacred nature of relationships with land and peoplehood, both to signal the urgency but also the reciprocal obligation involved with, say, Bear Butte or Onondaga Lake or Mauna Kea. But the modern West's category of religion has never been particularly apt to speak to the richness of these relationships. We don't have a religion, we have a way of life, so many Native peoples often insist. But as Suzan Harjo has made clear over the course of her career, Neither should we stop trying to invoke and bend the category of religion and religious freedom so crucial to American identity to apply more meaningfully to Native claims that are not simply or merely religious. As Suzan has said and written, it's not so much that Native languages have no word for religion, it's rather they have no one word for religion. That is, Native peoples have a rich vocabulary, not to mention syntax, grammar, and idiom for what is rather woodenly called in the West religion. Among my favorites, according to Suzan, is a Cheyenne word, people who go to ceremonies who don't have the religion to back it up. I think this is a good way to frame Harjo's game-changing work on religious and cultural freedoms and sacred site protection. It shows her command not only of the specificity of the many Native traditions she has worked to represent, but also the poetics of her politics, her command of language, her uncanny ability to articulate issues in ways that draw allies in, confound adversaries, and move people to think differently. 20 minutes just can't do justice to Harjo's inspiring contributions on religious and cultural rights. Speaking from a longer draft chapter, my aim here is to choose a few that illustrate three key features of Harjo's remarkable and inspiring contribution. Point 1, we shouldn't take for granted that religious and cultural freedoms would be significantly on the map apart from Suzan Shown Harjo's making the case that they should be. As she herself emphasizes, she wasn't alone in this. She had amazing mentors like Vine Deloria Jr. and others, but she was articulate and persistently so in persuading tribal leaders to back an agenda that many of them were not initially prepared to do, focused as they typically were on helping their peoples through economic development and political nation building. While working at NCAI, Morningstar, and elsewhere on a full range of political, economic, and land recovery issues, Harjo consistently made the case that religious and cultural protections are atmospheric, foundational to everything else. If the traditional Indians stop being the traditional people, she said, if in 100 years you have a situation where there's no tribal language, no tribal religion, and everyone has stopped dancing, then how long do you think the tribe is going to be recognized for anything we enjoy because of a special relationship? That'd be about a day and a half, she had said. Second point, as Gabi said, the legislative and legal struggle for religious and cultural rights began at a sacred place, at Bear Butte, actually, in 1967, where Suzan was called, along with a number of other people, by Cheyenne spiritual leaders to meet after their 4-day summer ceremonies to talk about an agenda about religious and cultural rights, among other things. And Harjo's NAGPRA efforts began with a vision of the Cheyenne girl in the dress. Perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that from Professor Riding-In. But how to stay thus grounded? How to keep one's eyes on the horizon amid the shifting, swirling, chaotic seas of hardball politics? It's always prayer first, Harjo responds, not skipping a beat when I put the question. As with the words that come before all else, the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, invocations or prayer songs at the outset of negotiations or brainstorming sessions, Harjo says, don't involve necessarily divine petition for a particular outcome. Still, beginning with thanks for the good day in the Cheyenne idiom can properly syncopate and order a meeting and unify a gathering toward one mind. Harjo says it can prevent entering negotiations with anger, can unclutter the mind to clearly analyze a situation, and especially where there seems to be no way through, and to be open to inspiration about a way through, and to help calibrate strategic decisions as to when to insist on priorities and when to make compromises on behalf of deeper commitments. To begin with, prayer is nothing new for Native advocates and activists, but it does bespeak Harjo's commitment to coalition building that runs deeper than politics. The story of Harjo's accomplishment is the story of the coalitions she either convened, nurtured, or joined in support. Such work is, of course, political and strategic, but it can also be, as in her case, generative over time of the renewal of the very religious and cultural practices that it sets out to protect. To help us panelists get our stories straight, Suzan has been sending us notes with long lists of names on each accomplishment, careful catalogs of the people power behind the remarkable accomplishments of the period, nods to the relationships that began with visions in sacred places and that were fueled by deep engagement with traditional spiritual leaders throughout Indian country. Harjo has keenly recognized that Native nations and their own spiritual leaders know best what is required to fulfill religious obligations to places, practices, and ancestors. I turn now to the development and work of this coalition on religious and cultural rights, which launched at Bear Butte in 1967 and grew over the ensuing 10 years, ultimately producing the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978. Momentum and clarity of vision through a range of gatherings and meetings that Harjo, with Raymond Spang and her husband Frank Ray, attended, first at Zuni Pueblo and other pueblos, and then on to California, Oregon, and Washington. Convenings, she said, often took place after conferences called for other purposes and centered on issues identified at Bear Butte, as well as increasing desecration of sacred places and sacred objects, violation of cultural items in airports and border crossings, disrespect for religious ways in schools and prisons, workplaces and military service, arrests of Native practitioners with eagle feathers, growing anti-Indian violence in border towns. As it grew, Harjo's coalition drew on the increasing capacity of tribal governments and the increasing muscle and visibility of the American Indian movement in the early 1970s. Although the picture in this period is complex, tribal officials were often at odds with AIM leaders and in many cases out of sync with the traditional religions and spiritual leaders. It took some convincing to make cultural and religious rights a priority on their agenda, as it did to persuade AIM leaders to work toward concrete gains. From the beginning, Harjo's coalition took its cues from local indigenous efforts and arguably cut its teeth through support to the fish-ins, where Pacific Northwest nations asserted off-reservation rights under a series of treaties in the 1850s to take salmon in the usual and accustomed places. When their struggle took to the courts, a series of victories affirming off-reservation treaty rights have been huge successes for religious and cultural rights. The religious and cultural freedom questions of these cases, I'm skipping over to stay in my 20-minute time so we hear from everybody on my panel. The religious and cultural freedom questions of these cases are not simply a function of the occasional ceremony. As Harjo puts it, even when people are talking about fishing rights or hunting rights, they're talking about religion, talking about not just the ability to go out and shoot a deer or get a salmon or pick a berry, talking about the song that is the first salmon song that goes before the season, or the prayers that prepare the land asking the buffalo to allow themselves to be taken, or the huckleberries to return. There were also incremental victories in these early years of the 70s. Harjo supported and broadcast the stories of these, but used them really and tried to leverage them toward a more fuller-throated commitment on the part of the United States to Native religious and cultural freedom. Harjo helped secure candidate Jimmy Carter's support for Native religious freedom, which he made at a meeting with tribal leaders a week before the election. One of the meetings that Harjo remembered started with an invocation and a prayer, and that evidently really mattered. She said at that meeting, he went off the script, President Carter did, that she wrote for him and said, looked at everybody and said, you know, I'm going to sign an American Indian Religious Freedom Act bill because the Bible tells me so. Bespeaking his strong Baptist commitment to religious freedom generally. If an ironic one. Carter had appointed Harjo in 1978 as his congressional liaison in Indian affairs, and despite some misgivings in his Interior and Justice Departments, supported passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was bookended in the Senate by Ted Kennedy and Barry Goldwater, and championed in the House by Morris Udall, but faced serious opposition from other congressional leaders concerned about the disruptive impacts on public lands for extractive and tourist industries, and who threatened to kill the bill if it had any serious teeth for sacred land protection. Nonetheless, she persisted. excuse me, with the policy statement and the catalog of acknowledgments of the federal government's historic errors through the civilization regulations and other overt or implicit policies that frustrated Native American religious freedom. AIRFA also required federal agencies to evaluate their policies and to consult with Native traditional leaders and write a report to Congress the next year. Harjo was asked by President Carter to oversee this process, and she was the primary author on the report, along with a number of other major intellectual giants. AIRFA has mattered more than is well known, and this is an important point, I think, to know in appreciating Suzan Shown Harjo's legacy. Many scholars, historians, and others have simply rehashed the story of AIRFA that was told in the devastating 1988 Supreme Court decision that not only saw no First Amendment protection for Native sacred lands, but also found no meaningful American Indian Religious Freedom Act protections because it, quote, had no teeth, end quote. There isn't time here for a fuller account, but I can identify 5 aspects of AIRFA's ongoing significance that I want us to think about. First, AIRFA was a formal acknowledgement of the damage done by the U.S. under its civilization regulations, and I use the word civilization in scare quotes there. It was also kind of commonly referred to as the Religious Crimes Code between 1883 and 1934, formally criminalizing religious and cultural practices of Native peoples. And AIRFA also involved a rejection of future policies that might even inadvertently serve to obstruct Native religious freedom. Second, AIRFA formally extended the federal trust responsibility beyond monetizable resources to cultural resources, Native religions, cultures, and languages. Third, AIRFA established that the federal agencies must consult with traditional religious leaders and governments, helping establish the broader consultation framework that has, of course, waxed and waned with subsequent administrations, but on the whole has grown in shape and stature. Fourth, AIRFA provided the necessary policy umbrella for much of the follow-on legislation, including the NMAI Act and NAGPRA. Finally, AIRFA drew rhetorically on the language of religion, but is better understood as a religious and cultural rights contribution to federal Indian law than as an American Indian amendment to religious freedom law. When read in light of the 1970s clarifications in law and in the courts of the special relationship, AIRFA appears not simply as a narrowly religious freedom gain, but as a gain toward a particular kind of religious freedom for Native nations as collectivities, and which remains wedded to the notion that they hold a special political and legal status that renders their rights differently than the civil liberties, including religious freedom, of other American citizens. AIRFA's Peyote Amendment in 1994 illustrates this point well. When the Supreme Court criminalized ceremonial peyote use in Employment Division v. Smith, a decision in 1990, it also dramatically restricted the reach of religious freedom generally, to only those cases where government expressly seeks to prohibit religious exercise. This Supreme Court decision united civil liberties and religious freedom groups from across the culture war spectrum. And they got an almost unanimous Congress to pass in 1993 the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, to restore religious freedom protections to their pre-Smith, the name of that decision, status. But this broad RFRA coalition expressly excluded Native voices and didn't remedy the specific injustice that Smith had done in criminalizing overnight the religion of tens of thousands of members of the Native American Church. With Walter Echohawk, among others, Harjo sought instead a toothy amendment to AIRFA, tailoring protections for ceremonial peyote use to the special legal and political status of Native American nations rather than to the religious identities of Native individuals, an accommodation that courts would otherwise surely have found unconstitutional under the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. That AIRFA was in place made possible religious freedom for adherents of the Peyote Way and offers the possibility for further amendments to protect sacred places where the courts have failed to deliver on the First Amendment or RFRA alone. The AIRFA policy review process that Harjo captained focused attention on potential law and policy interventions on behalf of Native religious and cultural rights in the years of her growing influence. Some, like the land returns in Maine, brought sacred land protections as a function of their coming under Native control. Other laws, especially NAGPRA, which Professor Ridingen will soon address, squarely enact rights protections for Native American people specifically. But absent a legislative cause of action by which Native peoples could bring sacred place claims to the courts, the most meaningful protections for sacred lands arose through administrative processes. The outcomes varied depending on which federal agency was involved and what the political and economic circumstances were on the ground, as well as who occupied the White House. But behind each of the victories lies the often unsung behind-the-scenes work orchestrated by Suzan Harjo. And I'm skipping. If you see things on my slides that I'm not speaking to, that's because, again, I'm trying to stay within my limits. Before we turn to some emblematic examples of protected sacred places, though, it's important to know of some system-wide interventions where Harjo's team helped shape those outcomes from the top down. Working in the Carter White House, Harjo was crucial to the protection of numerous sacred places and vast tracts of subsistence and traditional use areas in Alaska through a series of President Carter's actions implementing deferred provisions of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act that ultimately led to the withdrawal or designation as areas for subsistence use over 100 million acres of land. Harjo provided special assistance to Alaska Native villages and federal agencies with arguments for site selections and cultural protections for subsistence use lands. Thank you. Which became part of the 1980 Alaska Native National Interest Conservation Act and played a role in President Carter's designation of 17 national monuments, each of them including Native sacred places and traditional uses. Especially amid competing energy and other interests, this didn't come easy, and the scale of these protections for indigenous ways of life is huge. I learned that the National Park Service's acreage of protected lands actually doubled with the actions that Suzan was involved with during Carter's administration through these Alaska actions, and it's worth knowing about that. Harjo also worked hard behind the scenes to secure President Clinton's 1996 executive order on American Indian sacred sites, mandating that agencies that are managing federal lands take into account, as the verbiage of the executive order suggests, the impacts of those policies on sacred sites. Suzan was in on drafting sessions at the Departments of Defense, Interior, and Justice and helped navigate strong opposition to craft a robust compromise that President Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton committed to issue. If consultation with tribal governments is incumbent on any federal agency, agencies have variously delivered on the commitment to consultation. To help raise the standard, President Clinton, during Harjo's active years, issued an executive order on consultation and coordination with Indian tribal governments in 2000, and President Obama signed a 2010 memorandum reiterating the importance of consultation and expressly looking for interagency coordination to improve the protection and tribal access to Indian sacred sites. Where it did happen, incremental progress on sacred place protection owed much to the efforts coordinated by Harjo and Morningstar. She convened at least 5 summits between 1995 and 2008 that brought players together to share and coordinate strategy. In 2002, for example, she and Vine Deloria and others organized a forum held at the Department of the Interior to expand knowledge across federal agencies of policies and best practices to protect sacred places and to encourage others for their use. One of Morningstar Institute's signature efforts in recent years has been its Day of Prayer for Native American sacred places. The annual announcement includes a running list of sacred places that reads like a national register of Native sacred places under threat. The story of each could fill a volume. Even brief glimpses show the profound commitments to sacred places and the impact that Harjo's artful advocacy through lobbying Congress and agency officials, coordination of litigation, and targeted site-specific legislation, and how that mattered. Because my time is almost up, I'm just going to show you some of the images that describe some of these places that she's been involved with. I'll end with this one because, as you know, in the news today, the executive authority that Congress delegated to the president through the American Antiquities Act allows presidents with executive action to reserve and proclaim lands as national monuments. Suzan had been involved with many of them from different administrations. And even though she wasn't totally at the helm of the proclamation by President Obama of Bears Ears National Monument, she did support Jody Archambault in the White House in helping craft Obama's commitments to sacred places that produced that amazing result. Bears Ears National Monument, as you might know, is over 1 million acres of land in southern Utah that is a veritable sacred district to Navajo, Ute Mountain Ute, Hopi, Zuni, and Hopi, and one other nation. It's been known by one scholar to be the first native national monument because those nations came together and created the blueprint for President Obama to designate as a national monument. And that blueprint included very serious collaborative management, sort of hardwired into the National Monuments Act. I'm drawing to a close here. But as you perhaps know, President Trump, as one of the first moves in office, called for a review of recent large proclamations of national monuments and gutted Bears Ears by 85%. And this, I think, is emblematic. It's not alone. It's emblematic of the current moment, of many of the gains that Suzan had been so hard at work at over these decades, and how vulnerable they are where they haven't been made invulnerable under the law. And I just want to conclude with these words. The considerations of my chapter in this talk and Harjo's career, even in this uncertain moment, is fed by something deeper than faith in politics. Harjo's work began in 1967 at a sacred place, and it always started with prayer. And perhaps now more than ever, those lessons illuminate not only how past gains have been made against long odds, but how to act in this current political moment. Suzan related in a phone conversation a couple weeks ago that even the difficult compromises in defending the sacred seemed caught up in something more than the sum of the parts. Unlike the DC adage that a good deal is when everybody walks away feeling like they lost equal amounts, she said, Suzan said that more often than not in the cases we've been talking about, that when it began with prayer and you're grateful for the good day, as she said, parties could be at peace with the outcome, or at least in the realm of a peaceful outcome, and be able to go back to their elders and spiritual leaders with something good to say. And in those cases where this wasn't true, she said, the places themselves will be here forever. I have to believe that. Just look at them. Thank you.